Welcome back to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 105. Book review number 10. This will be the fifth book review about the Vikings I've done in the past 8 or 9 months. This book is the most demanding of the five, but also the most rewarding. Considering my original purpose in starting this study of the Vikings, imagine that, the toughest book is also the most rewarding. The Viking Discovery of America by Helge and Stine Ingstad. Checkmark Books of Facts on File, New York, 2001. But in cooperation with Breakwater Books of St. John's, Newfoundland, this book is 193 pages long, and it's designed like a coffee table book, 11 inches by 8.5 inches with high gloss paper, lots of maps, full color pictures, diagrams. Well, this book can be used as an interesting coffee table book, I suppose. This is a very scholarly book, I believe, and it's certainly thorough. It's part history, it's part literary criticism, it's part adventure story, it's part a report on an archaeological dig. For my purposes in researching the Vikings' discovery of America, this book hit the home run. First, let me discuss the authors. Helge Ingstad, 1899 to 2001. Wow, not many people get to live in 3 different centuries. And he was a Norwegian explorer, an adventurer, a lawyer, author, historian. Think along the terms of Indiana Jones. He was a graduate of the Oslo School of Law. His father was an engineer, his grandfather a lawyer. Ingstad practiced law in Norway for just a few years. Then he went to Canada as a fur trapper. Lived with the Indians. The name of the Indian tribe he lived with, they were called the Caribou Eaters. There you go. I'm sure that's a translation. Now, I have not eaten caribou, but I have eaten reindeer, and it was quite delicious. He wrote a best-selling book about his life as a trapper with the Caribou Eaters called Trapper Life. He also spent some time with the Apache Indians of northwest Mexico and wrote a book called The Apaches, The Hunt for the Lost Tribe. Ingstad served as governor of Eric the Red's land, Greenland, 1932 to 33. In 1941, he married Anne Stine Moe. She lived 1918 to 1997, 20 years his junior. But she read his books and began a correspondence with him and then turned into a marriage. She had received a master's degree in Nordic archaeology from the University of Oslo, and then a couple of honorary doctorates from Memorial University of Newfoundland and the University of Bergen, Norway. This book is the personal account of their search for and discovery of the Viking settlement in Vinland by Leif Erickson on the north shore of Newfoundland at L'anse Aux Meadows. I think I'm saying that right. For whom is this book written? Well, it is certainly profitable to use it as a coffee table book. I'm sure it's got plenty of interest for that, lots of pictures. But this book is really not for the casual reader who wants to just know about the Vikings. That's not who I would recommend it for. It's not really for the average college student who may be taking a survey course on the Vikings. Unless, if you're going to write a paper on the discovery of America by Leif Erickson, then this book would be very helpful. If you're taking a course on medieval literature and are interested in the Icelandic Sagas, right here, then this book would be helpful because there is much discussion in this book about the Icelandic Sagas. I presume that if you're a literary professor of medieval literature, right, that this book would be helpful also, as well as if you're a history professor and you're teaching about the Vikings, then certainly I would expect to find this on your bookshelf. For us normal people, though, if you love a good adventure story, certainly this book can be a lot of fun, but be aware there's a technical side to this book. So it's not just a quick, breezy book. There's a lot of technical literary criticism going on here, some archaeology. But another group that I want to read this book is those who are writing or have written a survey book of American history, such as Jill Lepore, who wrote These Truths in 2018. Those who choose not to tell the story of the Vikings in America, and that's Jill Lepore's book is marvelous. Okay, I don't mean to pick on her or anything, uh, but she leaves out the Vikings, as do a lot of modern history writers. They focus on other things. Now, this book, the only weak point that I can find in this book while reading it, um, my face did not get sprayed with ice cold seawater from the North Atlantic. And it created a craving in me for some fresh walrus meat grilled over coals. But I could not find any for sale in Fort Worth, Texas. So instead, I am eating skyr, Icelandic provisions, yogurt. So no fresh walrus meat for me. But the book creates those desires, right? It's an adventure book. I do have Icelandic water as well. There you go. But the book is an adventure story. It is. Now, the strengths of this book are numerous. Starting with the foreword, I mean, he thanks his wife, of course, who led the archaeological dig, but also he thanks the local fisherman who led him to the ruins, George Decker. And this is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And a local fisherman is responsible for showing it to this adventurer and this archaeologist. What an amazing providence, right? And this dogged husband-wife team who followed all the medieval clues they could, and then sailed the route and reconned the route with an airplane. And I mean, they thoroughly followed the route that they found here in the Icelandic Sagas, and they checked it out for themselves. Just the right man and woman team meeting the right man on the vicinity of L'anse Aux Meadows. They're in Newfoundland, and that old fisherman, he took them to the site and showed them and made history. Scholarship and daring do combined with providence. Yeah. Now, chapter 2 of this book, Ships and Navigation, gives a brief but solid and vigorous introduction to the Viking Age. Ingstad writes, there may have been many and diverse reasons for these Viking Age voyages. One of them may well be overpopulation, but no less important were a desire for profit and a craving for adventure. We know perfectly well that the people of the North could be ruthless, but this must not be permitted to eclipse the fact that they also engaged in trade, and that in their voyages of discovery for new lands, hard work meant more than brandishing swords. For centuries, the Norsemen crossed the enormous northern ocean from the west coast of Norway to North America. In their open ships with square sails, they sailed here in all kinds of weather, often through masses of drift ice. Such long and demanding, often perilous voyages could not have been carried out without a high standard of shipbuilding and seamanship. Here's an example of excellent writing. I mean, that's the thing that I said about, the book gives you the sense of the salt spray in your face, right? This chapter, combined with chapter 10, reminds me greatly of the writing of Admiral and Professor Samuel Eliot Morison in his biography of Christopher Columbus, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1942. Morrison, again, actually sailed parts of the route that Columbus took, like Ingstad sailing the route of Leif Erickson. So that's as pure of a research and adventure as you can get. On page 3, Ingstad shows what is perhaps the greatest weakness of the Greenlander Vikings. All material for shipbuilding had to be imported from Norway. Ships were absolutely essential for the people of these two distant islands, Iceland and Greenland. The Vikings sailed the most storm-tossed, ice-filled seas in the world that were notoriously foggy and cloudy, which hindered navigation by the sun and stars. These were incredibly brave, hard-working, risk-taking, strong and vigorous people. Do we even measure up today? I don't know. This kind of character should not be forgotten today. On chapter 3, the Norse community in Greenland tells the story of the Viking conquest of the North Atlantic and settling Iceland and Greenland. Here we find the story of Eric the Red, who had to flee both Norway and Iceland for legal criminal reasons like murder. When he was banished from Iceland, he sailed west to find the land that Gunnbjorn Ulfsson found accidentally when blown off course. In 982, Eric found Greenland and explored the west coast, a more temperate climate than on the east coast because of how the Gulf Stream works. After 3 years, then he returned to Iceland and led an expedition the next year, 986. 25 ships loaded with 300 people, dogs, goats, sheep, pigs, horses, and cattle. Can you imagine being in a Viking longboat with a bull or a full-grown horse and pigs? Wow, I can't even imagine that. The waves, the fog, the storms in the North Atlantic, icebergs and ice floes all around. A little over half made it to where Eric had settled in the southwest of Greenland, at Eric's Fjord, and named his farm Bradahild. And that farm's been found and is another preserved treasure there in Greenland. Ingstad discusses the arrival of Christianity in Greenland and its history throughout. One of the most terrible and sad statements is on page 97. In 1721, Hans Egede, the Norwegian missionary, sailed to the southwest coast of Greenland, and he expected to find Norsemen living in the ancient settlements there. He found no one. In chapters 4 through 9, Ingstad examines the ancient sources for the story of Greenland, and here's just the meat of the book. He discusses the actual physical copies of the sagas that remain, but then goes into amazing detail of the text of the Greenlander saga versus Eric the Red's saga. Using literary criticism, he details why he thinks the Greenlander saga is the older of the two and the more reliable of the two, and why the saga of Eric the Red is not as reliable and is more recent. He uses the Greenlander saga as a source, or Eric the Red's saga uses Greenlander saga as a source, but then twists the story to heighten the role of Christianity and of Icelanders in the discovery of Vinland. Ingstad writes on page 30, during the second half of the 19th century, Eric's saga of Vinland was generally regarded to be the more reliable of the two. I would say that some modern scholars also seem to rely more on Eric's saga, at least in the reading on the Vikings that I have done. There does seem to be this heavier use of Eric's saga. But Ingstad, his reasoning makes a lot of sense to me because he's writing as a sailor, and he points out some very specific things that the Greenlander saga includes that the saga of Eric does not include, which would indicate the Greenlander saga was based on experience, much more historical as far as what would a sailor actually write. And so here let me read a lengthy quote from pages 33 to 34. Ingstad believes that Bjarni Herjolfsson saw the islands off Canada and reported what he saw upon arriving in Greenland. Then Leif Erickson goes on an expedition in the reverse direction that Bjarne took, according to the Greenlander saga. And Ingstad does an intense examination of that route personally. He sails it. He flies over an airplane to see what Bjarne and Leif actually saw. And he is able to correctly identify the geographic features recorded in the saga firsthand. And this was an outstanding example of original research. Ingstad identifies Helgeland with the flat stones of Baffin Island, Markland with the woods and no pasture that Labrador had, and Vinland as the island of Newfoundland with woods and pasture land, which is a key to understanding the Vikings. So here's a long quote on 33 to 34. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus was a singular event which ushered in a new era, but the Greenlanders and the Icelanders must have seen the discovery of the new lands in the West in an entirely different light. Not only had they not the slightest idea that these new lands formed part of a continent, but their attitude to discovery was altogether quite different from that of Columbus and those who came after him. The Norsemen were not searching for gold and other riches. They were simply looking for a goodly land where their families might settle down and live, a place with ample pasturage for their cattle, with forest, game, and fish. All this they found in Vinland. Although it seems likely that the discoveries were regarded with considerable interest during the time immediately following the Vinland expedition, they hardly created the stir conveyed by the sagas. The discovery of new land was no singular event at the time. This was an age of discoveries. We must, moreover, bear in mind that these new lands, west and southwest of Greenland, were of very little practical importance to the people of Iceland, where the sagas were written. The distance was far too great for that. For the Greenlanders, on the other hand, this was not so, for these new regions were a neighboring land where they probably fetched timber for shipbuilding and hunted. So again, there's this difference between the Eric the Red saga and the Greenlander saga, and the difference seems to be firsthand experience. Right. They were pastoralists. They were raising cattle. They needed that pasture. And on pages 105 to 108, Ingstad discusses the etymology of the word Vinland, Vin, and shows pretty conclusively how it had been mistranslated and misunderstood down to our present day. Adam of Bremen, a German churchman who is one of our primary sources, got some misinformation from another churchman in Iceland, Leif Erickson, first bishop of Iceland. The word Vin in Nordic meant meadow, pasture land, not vines. Adam of Bremen, a German who knew grapevines automatically, assumed he knew the word meant vines. Reading how Ingstad breaks this down was fascinating, and I can see his legal training being put to good use here. Another wonderful example of scholarship is when Ingstad examines old maps of Greenland in chapter 9, showing which maps are older, who copied who, where mistakes were made, and where things were amazingly accurate. Then in chapters 10 through 12 is the story of how the Ingstads properly identified L'anse Aux Meadows as the site for Vinland, just going off of the geography of it. And then they found this fisherman who took them to the site. Chapter 12 is written by Stine Ingstad, and it's a condensed report of her archeological work at the dig there. So some of that's pretty technical. The diagrams can be technical as well. The epilogue alone in this book is worth the price. One of the questions he raises on page 173 is one I've wondered about but have seen no other scholar raise. Did the Greenlanders continue to sail to North America after the time of the Vinland voyage? It seems extremely likely, and he presents some evidence for why he believes that. On pages 176 to 177, he discusses the Viking coin found in 1957 in May in Maine. I've seen this mentioned in several books or articles where it was always phrased as controversial, supposed Viking coin, etc., casting doubt on it. But Ingstad makes a very strong, solid case for its being genuine and includes pictures of it. Along the way, he has mentioned a few other cases of Viking material showing up in places that might indicate either Indians trading for things or were given gifts and those things went far afield. But we don't have a good explanation of the Viking coin it buried in Maine. But he convinced me it is a Viking coin, and it was definitely found in Maine. On pages 178 to 180, he asks another question that I've wondered about. What became of the Greenlanders? There's evidence from the Skálholt Annals of the 17th century, so that's pretty late, in the 1600s. But there's evidence that they sailed west to Canada. And so he thinks maybe to Markland or Labrador. Markland is Labrador. But maybe some future archaeologist or fisherman will find that site. Now, I would love to carry on in my studies of the Vikings, but I think I may have enough to pursue my own original objectives now with some new direction. Until next time, this is StabtheDragon, out here.